Cradle of Judas. Worst punishment in human history. Punishments are a part of everyday society. They've been around since the dawn of civilization, and for the most part, they've served humankind well. But there have been times when punishments have gone too far. In this video, we'll check out some of the most severe punishments throughout history, and the most sadistic one on the list is the Cradle of Judas. These punishments will leave you wondering how anyone could have thought they were a good idea. So, watch the video until the end, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Torture is everywhere in history, and most of them are cruel and inhumane. Torture has been used to punish, intimidate, and extract information from the victim. It was used to punish people for their crimes against society or the state. The Judas cradle is one such torture device that was widely used during the medieval period as a method of execution for traitors and criminals alike. Before we move on to the Judas cradle punishment, we have some other punishments that will definitely keep you on the edge of your seat. At number 1, we have the head crusher. The head crusher was used during the Middle Ages to extract confessions from criminals. This device was literally a huge pair of pincers that slowly crushed the victim's head, often causing death by asphyxiation or loss of blood through ruptured blood vessels. The torturer would place the victim inside the enclosed box with their head sticking out of a hole at one end, and then slowly close the jaws by turning a handle until they broke through to crush their skull and break their neck bones. It was an agonizing way to die, but it could take many hours for them to die as these devices were designed in such a way that they stopped just before breaking through to cause instant death. According to the Torture Museum in Washington, D.C., pressing was also a popular form of torture that involved crushing the chest and rib cage with heavy stones or weights until the person confessed. It was used during the Middle Ages and was meant to extract confessions from people accused of witchcraft and also from people accused of treason. The person being pressed would be laid on their back with their arms and legs held down by boards or sometimes other weights. Then either heavy stones or other weights were piled onto their body, or they were placed into an iron jacket, like a medieval straitjacket, that crushed them as well. They would be left there until they either died or confessed. Next, we have Chinese water torture. The Chinese water torture is one of the most painful and longest-lasting punishments in human history. The victim was strapped to a chair in a dark room with weights on their ankles and wrists. The container of water was then poured onto their heads using 2 pitchers or buckets while they were repeatedly asked questions. If they gave an incorrect answer or refused to cooperate, the torturers would pour more water over them until they lost consciousness. This process could go on for hours and sometimes days at a time, as long as there were no signs of death or permanent damage, which did happen. In addition to being physically painful, this method also caused emotional distress because it forced people who had been tortured into saying whatever you wanted them to say in order for you to not continue torturing them any longer than necessary. The next punishment to mention is Sacfism, which was popular in ancient times. Sacfism was a form of torture that involved laying the victim in a wooden tub, covering them with honey, and leaving them to die of exposure. It was used in ancient Persia as a punishment for traitors and other criminals who were deemed unworthy of burial. The victim would be placed inside the tub and tied securely to a stake driven into the ground. The person's hands would also be tied behind his back so he couldn't move or get out of the tub when bees attacked him. This allowed his wounds to fester and become infected. Have you ever heard of a Spanish donkey? It's a punishment, not a real donkey. The wooden horse, or Spanish donkey, was a common punishment used in the Middle Ages. It was typically used for crimes like blasphemy, heresy, or treason. The offender would be placed on a wooden horse with their hands and feet tied. They would then be left in this position for days or even weeks until they died of dehydration or exhaustion. The punishment was considered very cruel and was often used as a deterrent for other criminals. It is no longer used today, but it is still considered to be one of the cruelest and most inhumane punishments in history. So the next punishment on the list is the pillory. This one sounds like a lot of fun, but the pillory was a public punishment where the person was put in a pillory, a wooden device with holes for the head and hands. The person was then forced to stand or sit on a stool and held there for an extended period of time. Punishment by pillory often took place in public areas such as marketplaces or other public gathering places. People could throw things at the pilloried person while they walked through the streets. Sometimes stones and rotten food were thrown at them too. The purpose of this punishment was to humiliate the person who received it, as well as provide entertainment for those watching them suffer through torture. So the next punishment on our list is the Ling Qi 1,000 cuts, which is a Chinese punishment. The Chinese practice of execution by 1,000 cuts was carried out with various tools and weapons. A typical execution would include someone cutting through the victim's skin with a knife or spear point until they died from blood loss or organ failure. This process could take anywhere from 10 minutes to hours, depending on how hard your killer worked to ensure your demise. The name Ling Qi translates into English as the slow slicing method and was used in China between 900 AD and 1905 AD, as well as in Japan, Vietnam, and Korea during that same time period. Have you ever thought about how someone could be punished by having their tongue cut out if they didn't want to listen to someone? The Romans had a few different ways of dealing with slaves who spoke out of turn. For example, if you were a slave and told your master something he didn't want to hear, you could be beaten or have your tongue cut out. The Romans used this punishment for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes it was used as a punishment for traitors, other times it was used as a punishment for liars. But when it came to speaking out in general, cutting out someone's tongue was essentially the equivalent of being silenced forever. So the next punishment on our list is blinding. Blindness is one of the cruelest punishments in human history. Not only does it rob you of your sight, but it also robs you of your livelihood, as blindness makes people unable to work. In most cases, blinding was done by cutting out a person's eyes, rather than burning them out with hot pokers, as was more common in medieval times. Blinding was usually reserved for criminals who had committed crimes against their fellow man. Adultery, blasphemy, and spying were all punished by blinding to varying degrees. Witchcraft was also considered a crime worthy of being blinded. Usually both eyes were cut out so that they couldn't see where they were flying off to on broomsticks or what spells they were casting. Still, it's child's play compared to the Judas Cradle. The Judas Cradle was a torture device used during the Middle Ages. It consisted of a sharpened point placed on a seat, and the victim would be forced to sit on the point, impaling themselves. The torturer could then increase the pain by rocking the cradle back and forth, making the point penetrate further into the victim. The more the victim suffered, the better it was for the executioner. This torture method made executioners feel like gods and kings because they had so much power over someone's life. They could decide when to stop or not stop, who would live and who would die. After being tortured for days, victims were only left with one option to die. The Judas Cradle was a cruel form of torture and was often used on heretics and witches. It was also used as a way to publicly humiliate someone, as the victim would often be left on display for days or even weeks. While the Judas Cradle is no longer used, it still stands as a symbol of the torture and cruelty that was inflicted during the Middle Ages. The Judas Cradle was first mentioned in a book published in 1595, but it's unclear exactly when it was invented. Some historians believed it was used as early as the 13th century, while others believe it didn't come into use until the 15th or 16th century. However, there is no definitive answer. The device got its name from the biblical character Judas Iscariot. Judas was one of the 12 disciples of Jesus Christ who betrayed him to the authorities. As punishment for his betrayal, Judas was said to have been hanged on a tree. It is thought that the Judas Cradle was named after Judas because of the similarity between his punishment and the torture device. While the inventor of the Judas Cradle is unknown, it was invented in either Spain or Italy during the 15th century. The rack, also known as the strappato or Judas Cradle, was a medieval torture device used to stretch and dislocate a victim's joints. The rack originated from Italy in the 13th century when it was used to punish people who committed crimes such as treason or heresy. The torturers would tie the victim spread-eagled on top of two parallel wooden bars that were gradually raised from a horizontal position until the subject's joints were dislocated by their own weight. This stretching was meant to cause excruciating pain, but not death. However, there is evidence that this method did kill at least one person. Pope Innocent VIII died after his sentence of being racked was carried out by his successor, Alexander VI, who had been elected thanks to Innocent's influence. Many modern historians believe that another predecessor of our modern-day strappado could have been used by ancient Greek doctors, referred to as Hippocrates and Galen, who practiced medicine using drugs rather than surgery techniques, which were still under development at that time period, known as the Age of Enlightenment, which refers back again into medieval times, where these kinds of methods were very popular among those who found pleasure within suffering others endured just so they could gain power over them instead. So there you have it. The worst punishments in history were cruel and unusual. They were often carried out in public to humiliate and degrade the victim. They also served as a warning to others who might disobey the law. These methods of punishments are now outlawed in many countries, but they serve as a reminder of the cruelty that humans are capable of. The Cradle of Judas is definitely the most sadistic punishment on this list. If you think that's bad, don't forget to like and subscribe. And what do you think is the worst punishment in history? Let us know in the comments. We'll see you next time!